Welcome back to A Considerate Life. As is my wont, I read a variety of books and I lead the contemplative life. I think about them. So one of the books I read recently was The Seven Deadly Sins, Vanquishing, a Thomistic Guide to Vanquishing Vice and Sin. Now, I will say this. I'm a Protestant. This is a very Catholic book, and so some of the advice in it is very Catholic. But one of the things that I told my niece a while back is this, and I think this is true. There are at least two different ways to gain sort of an objective perspective on current culture. The first is to listen to people from other cultures. So, like when I was in high school, we had an intern from Japan, and we would ask him, what are the differences between Japan and America? How do you see American food or sports or culture or things like that? And we would get his very Japanese perspective on current American culture. The other way to gain a more objective perspective on culture is to read authors from other times. Now, given my interest in Thomas Aquinas and medieval philosophy, I read a lot of medieval philosophers and theologians. And one of the things that they take for granted is a very Christian philosophical context, something that's largely been lost in our more modern Western American culture. And so one of the things that occurred to me in reading through this book is that they talk about the seven deadly sins, pride, envy, wrath, sloth, greed, gluttony, and lust, right? Those are the seven deadly sins: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, greed, gluttony, lust. And in talking about the seven deadly sins, they start outlining the daughters of those sins. That is, there are certain other sins that arise from, say, pride or gluttony or greed. And that's what I wanted to take a look at very briefly today. Is we look at our culture and we say that people are struggling with anxiety, or people are struggling with depression, or sort of a listlessness in their life. And what I wanted to point out today is that those are the daughters of sin. If we think about ourselves and our culture in a purely secular way, we can miss the fact that some of these, what we would call mental health issues, they actually arise from a culture that has gotten all too comfortable with sin. Now, I'm not trying to get on my high horse and moralize over the culture. I'm doing this as an intellectual exercise and saying that there are concepts that are common from a medieval perspective, that if the medievals were to see some of the effects of, say, social media on our culture, they would say, yeah, of course you were depressed. Of course you were restless. Of course you were whatever, because these are daughters of well-known sins. And so that's what I wanted to bring to light today. Just very briefly, some of the things that are outcrops of sin that we call mental health issues today. I just want to read a passage from Vost where he sort of explains how one of these major sins, like greed or envy, can lead to other sins or conditions or effects. He says this. So somebody who is pride may give way to envy. Envy in turn generates anger. When the mind is pierced by the internal wound of envy, tranquility is lost. So envy is seeing something that someone else has as a deficiency to you. So someone got a raise, someone got a promotion, someone won the lottery, and you see their sudden enrichment as somehow a harm to you. Okay, so that's kind of the nature of envy. So you give way to the sin of envy, and because of that, when the soul is wounded by envy, inner tranquility is lost. There's a loss of peace, okay? When the mind strikes and harms itself by anger, melancholy ensues, or sadness ensues. When, due to grief and sadness, the soul obtains no joys from within, this sadness can beget avarice or greed for external goods, right? And so Vost is sort of following this trail of starting with the sin of pride, then envy, and then from envy comes this sadness, and from this inner wound of sadness, there's this drive to materialism, right? So some of these things that we see that are common on social media, for example, eccentricity, right? Eccentricity is listed here under vainglory or pride. And these are, I think, some of the young people who do things like the blue-haired people or shaving your head, like the eccentricities. It's a form of pride. It's just sort of, it's a way of getting people to look at you just because you're doing something eccentric. I think of like the Dennis Rodmans of the 90s, just this sort of eccentricity that is an outworking of vainglory or pride. And I think probably one of the biggest ones, and this goes all the way back to Facebook days. And one of the things about social media as it emerged was that people were only sharing the highlights of their life, right? I got the promotion. I just bought my first house. We just got married, right? All these highlights of your life are the things that you share. And it provokes consumption of that material, provokes people to envy. Look at their life. They've got the perfect wife, the perfect life, the perfect kids, right? And if we look at this list, some of the things that are downstream of envy: hatred, distraction, joy at another's misfortune, or grief at another's prosperity, right? And so I'm not going to belabor the point, but the main point is this. If we take seriously the idea that humans were created by God, and we were created to pursue the virtues and avoid the vices, then we can look at our social media landscape through the lens of this sort of this medieval theological framework. And we can see, wow, there must be something to this about the human soul. There must be something about the human soul that can't thrive in a context of constantly comparing my life to another's life and then lauding my victories over them or feeling deficient when they are somehow successful, right? So envy, pride, wrath, sloth, greed, gluttony, lust, right? These things. If we take seriously the idea of sin and righteousness, if we take more of a theological approach to even our social media consumption, we can note that these things like restlessness or anxiety or sadness or fear, these things that we call mental health issues are really downstream of a more fundamental human spiritual conditioning. And if all we're concerned about are the effect of restlessness or hatred, or right, then we're never going to find the initial root of those things, because the initial root of those things are deeper issues of pride and envy and greed, right? So it's these major sins that produce these minor sins, and it's all of this instability, this loss of inner tranquility. So that's it. I just wanted to point out the fact that oftentimes when we're looking at what we call mental health issues in society, that if we look at it from the perspective of these medieval theologians, they would see that what we're calling mental health issues are actually effects of deeper causes, those causes being these sort of major sins that people are not taking account of in their life.